All right, so we're looking at day 3 here, where we are talking about the respiratory system. So you'll notice our little schedule here, as we're kind of working our way through PFT 105, right? Um, we started by talking about like the ideas of metabolism. It's kind of like it was almost like this is our overall preview of everything we are going to need to understand before this whole course was over. And then we are now kind of talking about the ingredients that allow metabolism to take place, right? We got into the digestive system on Friday, where we started talking about like getting glucose and amino acids and fats, which are all the ingredients necessary to produce energy. Today we're looking at the respiratory system, where we're talking about learning how to extract oxygen. Tomorrow we'll talk about the cardiovascular system, how we're going to transport that oxygen. And then we'll talk a little bit about muscles right before the middle portion of our class. So, the thing that honestly in our industry, or at least in relation to us, eats the most energy. So, it's almost like this is sort of our concept here. And then we talked about getting the ingredients, transporting those ingredients, and then the biggest thing that uses all those ingredients, right? Then we're going to have our midterm and our review on day 6. That's also where we're going to have our in-person meeting there. And that, by the way, that is going to be, let's see, today's day, what is today? Today's day 3. Yeah, so 3, 4, 5, 6, it's going to be Thursday. So we're going to have 2 Thursday. Yeah, we're going to meet up here in at Sochi on Thursday. It's going to be kind of a fun one because we'll get a chance to do some cardio-based stuff, which I'm always excited to do. Then we are going to totally pivot the entire course. We're going to talk about metabolism as it relates to working out. We'll talk about training the anaerobic system, training the muscular system, training the aerobic system. And then we'll have a little talk on nutrition at the very end there, from a different perspective than when we were talking about the digestive system, right? Digestive system, we talked pretty much all about catabolically breaking stuff down. This nutrition part will be much more talking about like advising our clients and like building stuff up. So it's all about like, understanding the anatomy first, and then sort of getting into the physiology and training aspects of it in the second half of class. So today we're going to look at the oxygen part of things, right? Let's talk about breathing, right? So our breathing, I wanted to do a little bit of an extra intro, by the way, because there's no intro slides in this one. I was like, what are you doing, Nelson? Normally they have like a big, like, here's what we're going to be talking about today. We are going to be talking about pulmonary ventilation, right? Pulmonary ventilation is sort of the scientific fancy way of describing like breathing, right? That's what it is. It's the process of breathing or ventilating air, which is just a gas composed of lots of different things, into the lungs. Like that's one thing we got to remember about air, actually. Air and oxygen are different things. There is oxygen in air, but most of what air is actually nitrogen. There's actually more nitrogen in the air than there is oxygen molecules, like, and not just like a little bit more, like mostly more. About 78% of the atmosphere that we breathe in, every time you go, 78% of like that volume that filled up your lungs was actually nitrogen. You can see here. And then only about 20% of it was oxygen. And then there's some other stuff in there too. There's like argon and neon. Yeah, the thing that makes signs, say open. Or like, Budweiser, like those like weird neon signs. You got those in the air. And we got some carbon dioxide in the air. I mean, obviously, like we are breathing in oxygen and we're exhaling carbon dioxide. So that carbon dioxide is floating around the atmosphere. Lots of interesting like little gases in there. Yeah, argon's the big one, and I know neon's in there because I always think that one's interesting, and I can't remember any of the other like weird noble gases and stuff. Somebody the other day was like, "You're so good with all the chemistry stuff," and I was like, I'm good with carbon. I'm good with the human chemistry stuff. You get into any of the other, you get into gases or heavy metals, and it's like, so that is pulmonary ventilation. That's the process of breathing massive amounts of gas into our lungs, right? So The primary function, if we look at like if that's what the process of breathing is, the idea here is that we are trying to expose oxygen to our blood, right? So in the same way that like our goal with the digestive system was to deassemble food into glucose, into fatty acids, and into like amino acids, vitamins, minerals, and water, right? We are trying to catabolically break all of that up into individual components to where if it ran through our small intestine, and our small intestine is filled with blood vessels, those chemicals would literally just pass through the walls of our small intestine straight into our bloodstream. We are trying to expose the ingredients that make food to our bloodstream so that we would absorb it, right? The exact same thing is true of our respiratory system. Like exactly the same concept here, right? Pulmonary ventilation is all about having an environment that is protected within our body, that is going to expose oxygen to our blood cells so that that oxygen can pass through the walls and into our bloodstream. So I know I was talking about the human donut thing a lot on Friday, because like the human donut thing is a really great way to understand, like, your digestive system, as food is running through it is technically not inside your body. I know it's running through our body, but it's not in what is actually our body. It's not systemic. It's not actually in our bloodstream until it passes through those walls. Now it is, right? The same thing is true here, actually. Your lungs, again, you could thread a tube like straight into your lungs if you had to. And sometimes we have to, so your lungs are part of the outside environment. But like he talks about in the video, like, we're not like amphibians. We can't passively just take in oxygen from like, through our skin. We don't have that ability. But like some animals do, we have to expose our blood to this oxygen, right? And so that's where our lungs are taking place. We're going to see some structures here in a little bit that are going to allow oxygen molecules to pass through the walls. So that's the whole purpose here, right? The whole purpose of pulmonary ventilation is to expose oxygen to blood cells. And one of the things we're going to talk about is blood cells contain a molecule of iron, and iron and oxygen are good friends. They're quite attracted to one another. So looking at our cardiorespiratory system, which is a term you guys are going to hear all the time, right? The cardiorespiratory system is a little bit different than just the respiratory system. The respiratory system is responsible for gathering oxygen and like getting rid of CO2, right? Like getting oxygen as an ingredient, and then like exhaling CO2 as like a byproduct, right? Oxygen in, CO2 out, oxygen in, CO2 out, right? That's the respiratory system, right? It's exposing it. But obviously, like we need to be able to get that oxygen to our left big toe, which is not exactly close to our lungs, right? I guess our right big toe is technically that's about as far away from your lungs as you're going to get, right? So that's where we have our cardiovascular system come in. This is what we're going to talk about tomorrow. If your respiratory system is like gathering all of the things, the cardiovascular system is delivering it, right? The respiratory system is the bus station that gets people onto the buses, and the cardiovascular system are the buses dropping people off at their bus stops, right? So the cardiovasculatory, that is not how that's pronounced. The cardiovascular / circulatory systems are responsible for delivering oxygen molecules throughout the body, and CO2, to be fair, right? Like it's also getting CO2 back to the lungs. So when we say the cardiorespiratory system, we are putting those two things together. Its basic purpose is to deliver oxygen to the mitochondria of the cells, right? The whole purpose is to like use the respiratory part to gather them, cardiovascular delivers it, and your cells go, oh, awesome. And then it takes in that oxygen, sends it to the mitochondria to produce some energy, and your cell gets to stay alive. By the way, this is why, and I always bring this up, you guys can, this is always kind of a fun fact to help you kind of remember how important oxygen is. So a lot of people think that, let's say you tuck your right leg under your butt and you're sitting there watching TV and it's been under there for a while, right? And all of a sudden you're like, oh no, I can't feel my foot. And you're like, oh, your foot falls asleep, right? And then like you untuck it and you get that like major tingling. You're like, ah, so uncomfortable, right? So a lot of people think that like when you tuck your leg under, my mom told me this, right? You cut off all of the circulation to your foot. Now, luckily, that is not true. If that was true and you actually cut off circulation to your foot, there would be no blood delivery, right? And there would also be no like blood leaving either. What you're actually doing is you're actually pinching the nerves, and now your foot and your brain can't communicate anymore, and your brain knows that there should be a foot there, and so it starts sending a signal saying, hey foot, are you still down there? And then like it doesn't get a response, so it's like, hey foot, and it just starts screaming, right? It's like a little kid being like, mom, like, and it's like, what? Maybe it was only me. So like that signal, right? Finally, when you release your foot, all of a sudden you're hearing the screaming that the foot is doing back. And it's like, yeah, I'm freaking here. And then all of a sudden it's communicating and you're feeling all those pings. And that's the pins and needles that you feel when your foot falls asleep. If you were to cut off circulation, your foot would be dead. And that's we'd have to lob it off. So luckily, that is not what's happening. If you cut off oxygen to your body, the cells cannot breathe. If the cells cannot breathe, they cannot produce energy. If they cannot produce energy, they're done. So that's why our cardiorespiratory system is so important. We need to be able to, extract oxygen from the environment and then get that oxygen to wherever it happens to be going. And your cardiorespiratory system works together, right, with those two major components. So its basic purpose is to deliver oxygen to the mitochondria. This is why it's sometimes you'll hear like the respiratory systems rule. Sometimes you'll hear this definition. In fact, actually, I think next module you'll see this definition. They'll say the respiratory system is responsible for proper cellular functioning of the body. And it's like, yeah, actually it is. We kind of don't really always jump to that conclusion. We're like, it's just in charge of getting oxygen. Well, why do we get oxygen? To ensure proper cellular function. Your cells can't live without oxygen. That's their main food source. Then glucose, right? So that is the overall structure so far. So let's go ahead and take a look at the lungs here. Your lungs are these empty little sac-like structures, and they have these little components in them that make them really, 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 really good at increasing surface area and exposing as much of your blood as possible to your outside, to that outside environment, to that oxygen, right? So you guys might remember where we talked about the small intestine. We talked about why the small intestine has all those little folds, right? Actually, that's a great picture. I'm gonna pull that up real quick. And letting it load so I'm not impatient. All right, so we talked about how it has like all these like little like folds up and down. That saves space within our stomach, right? And then if you look on the inside, the tube, if you were to stretch the tube out, you would see all these little folds here, right? And they look like this, right? Those are your villi. And then on all of your villi, right, you've got all kinds of little hairs. Those are your microvilli. They don't really like absorb anything. They just kind of move chemicals around. So if there was like a slot here for like a vitamin, they can just like kind of wiggle it, and that can get sucked in the right tube. But like this is kind of what that looks like, right? So the reason this is like this, and you can see, look at all these villi, right? They're all stacked together, is it increases surface area, right? It massively increases the surface area, right? You can just see there's a ton of exposure. All those chemicals, they get a ton of exposure to your bloodstream because each of those is packed to the brim full of these little blood vessels, right? So what is the surface area of our small intestine? If you were to like unpeel it all, what is the surface area of the small intestine? It's about the size of like a tennis court. If you were to unfold, like in your stomach, right? If you were just unfold all that, you would have about 250 square meters or about the size of a tennis court worth of surface area. So that's kind of weird and crazy and kind of cool, right? All trapped in this like little area. And that's because, again, the way surface area works, the way I always like to show this to people is like, if we think about like what surface area is, right? Let's say I've got like a really big, I've got a really big square here, and I just cut this in half, right? And then I've got two individual squares, right? So then I've got two rectangles. I didn't change anything. All I did was put a little border down the middle. Well, here's the thing. Chemicals can be absorbed around the outside of this square, right? And now they can be absorbed around the outside of both these squares. So I just added, look at how much surface area I added, right? If you think about it, it's like, let's see, these are both about the same size now. And I added basically two lines. I increased the surface area by about 50% just by cutting this line in the middle. So, if I had, let's say, we'll make up a fake number here, 100 units of surface area here, I've got 150 over here. And then if I cut it in half again, if I cut each of those in half, right, that would further increase the surface area by about 50%. I know that obviously I'm actually deleting a little bit, but, imagine this is, I'm not losing any size here. Well, now I've increased the surface area of this one by 50%, that one by 50%. So I've actually taken 100 and I increased the surface area by 50%. And then I took that and I increased that by 50%. So I went from having a surface area of 100 to over double that, 225, just by making two cuts, right? Cut here and then I cut here. That's a substantial difference, right? And then the same thing would happen every time I increase it. So the smaller and smaller and smaller things get, yeah, it looks very, very tiny, but it increases the surface area massively. So here's the thing. Carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, right? Let's just look at a carbohydrate again, right? Carbohydrates, proteins, and fats are combinations of all these chemicals coming together, right? Carbon, hydrogen, two hydrogen, oxygen, another hydrogen, right? So lots of that, right? And this little carbon skeleton here, and then lots of oxygen, lots of hydrogen. That's a carbohydrate. That's pretty darn small. But you know what's way smaller than that? Each of these little things individually, just oxygen all by itself, or maybe two little oxygen molecules attached to one another. That's really small, right? So we may be absorbing like billions of carbohydrate little molecules like every single day. You're absorbing trillions of oxygen molecules. So when we look in the lungs, which are these little sac-like structures, well, let's look that up. What is the surface area of our lungs? These get really, really small. So both of your lungs are roughly the size of a tennis court each, right? So if you were to like separate those and just like lay it out line to line, it would be 1,500 miles, actually. You could fit them on a tennis court, by the way, is what it's saying. But if you were to lay them out end to end, 1,500 miles worth of surface area. It's a lot. It's a lot of surface area, which is good because that is exposing us to lots and lots and lots of these little itty bitty chemicals that are just running through the atmosphere that are our oxygen, right? So they are empty, sort of, but they have all of these, we call it the conducting parts of our respiratory system, which are these little itty bitty materials that are covered in blood vessels. So each of your lungs is comprised of what are called your bronchi, okay? And your bronchi are these little tubes that branch throughout your lung. And so you can see, right, this is our trachea here, which is this like little cartilage tube that allows, this is just kind of like our esophagus. It's just the connection point that's allowing like oxygen and gases to like travel in. And then you'll notice it's going to branch in half like this, right? Those two major branches right there, these are your bronchi, okay? And then, so the bronchi, if we look at those, are the major like branches inside of our lungs, right? You can kind of see they're actually shaped. This is actually a good example of like asymmetry within your lungs, by the way. You can see there's a little bit of a different shape between your right lung and your left lung. They're actually not identical to one another. But you can see they're just going to branch off like that. So those are your bronchi. And then notice how there's more branches off from there. And then they branch smaller and smaller and smaller. Again, why do we do that? It increases surface area, right? So it branches smaller and smaller. Those little branches are called your bronchioles, right? So oxygen's moved into and out of your lungs because of this little, conduction, tube, right? And then you have your primary bronchi, or just we can call them your bronchi, and that's what branches off. Then if you want to like further separate it out, you could say there are your secondary bronchi, which are the like medium-sized ones. Honestly, most people just kind of break it into like the two big ones, and then they just go straight to talking about bronchioles. But yeah, if we want to get really specific about it, you get some little medium-sized ones that are, goes from large to medium to small. Those would be technically your secondary bronchi. And then eventually you have the little itty bitty ones, which we're not even seeing a very good picture of here. You want to see a really cool picture, actually. It actually looks a little bit more something like this. It gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And that is really kind of the inside, right? So there's the two major bronchi. And then look at all these little tiny branches, right? And honestly, not all of them are even here. There's some even smaller ones that obviously you can't convert to plastic. This is the bodies exhibit, by the way. If you ever get a chance, go to the bodies exhibit, guys. It's one of the coolest freaking things. You can see there's, I'm assuming this is like a smoker's lung. We'll definitely see this. Yeah, we'll see slightly different versions. That's a really cool one. Look at that one. That one's got the heart in the middle of it. And so these branch like smaller and smaller and smaller. Eventually they become bronchioles. So bronchioles are microscopic branches from the bronchi, and the bronchioles end in what's called an alveoli. And an alveoli, they are at the very, very end of all the bronchioles. These are extremely microscopic. These are very, 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 very small. So at the very end of every one of those tubes, right? Every one of these at the very end are what are called your alveoli. Okay. And so they look kind of like this. They kind of look like little balls of popcorn at the very end of all those tubes, right? So look at the tubes, right? They get smaller and smaller and smaller. Now remember, oxygen is traveling through here, and then it's kind of ending up in this little popcorn. And then from the outside, there are blood vessels that are absolutely covering all of that, we'll say popcorn, right? You can kind of see they're forming these little capillary beds. So oxygen travels into, here's where we kind of chopped off the top, right? You can see oxygen travels in through this little tube here, and it's covered in all this like webbing right here. And now those oxygen molecules are being exposed to the blood, and guess what? They're going to move instead of traveling back up the tube, right? They're going to travel through this little tube here, which is a blood vessel, right? It's very oxygenated, so it's going to go back to the heart so that the heart can deliver it to your right big toe slash everywhere. So that is what we've got, right? That's the whole process of ventilation, is moving these gases, right, into and out of the lungs. So the alveoli are microscopic popcorn-shaped sacs that are covered in blood vessels, and they act as the actual exchange site for oxygen. Oxygen is going to enter the blood. CO2 is going to leave the blood. And we're going to spend the rest of today talking about like why that actually happens. So again, pulmonary ventilation is just doing this. It's the process of driving air into and out of the lungs. But the actual like breathing, that's the difference between ventilation, which is like driving gases in, and respiration. Respiration is the exchange of gases, right? We'll see that in just a second. So, all right, so that's all the anatomy of like the pieces we're working with here. Does anybody have any questions on any of that? Is any of that not clear? And the bronchi is confusing. Alveoli. How we feeling, guys? Got one thumbs up. Everybody feeling good? All right, lots of thumbs up. Cool. We got a bunch of funds-reallys in here. That's all right. I don't know how many people are going to get that. So here we go. Let's take a look at all these. Let's look at respiration now. So, well, I guess we got to start. Well, yeah, we'll talk about ventilation. So, ventilation is breathing, right? Ventilation is like driving gases into and out of the lungs, right? Like I know that like we've been wearing masks for like a freaking year, right? And they're really uncomfortable feeling. And like some people are like, man, I can't get enough air. You know, you might have like an oxygen problem, you know, absolutely. Some people do. But what's kind of interesting is like the masks actually don't prevent you from bringing in enough oxygen into your lungs. It just decreases the total volume of gas that you're bringing into your lungs. So you're actually respirating just fine, but yes, you are struggling with ventilation. And that's what's kind of interesting. There is a slight difference between those two terms. Respiration is the exchange of oxygen molecules. Ventilation is the exchange of just moving gases from one place to another. Like honestly, if you just go to a window right now and just open up your window, you are increasing the ventilation in your room. It doesn't mean that you can breathe any easier or any harder, right? So ventilation is moving air, which again is mostly nitrogen, but also has all that other stuff into it, into and out of the lungs. So here's the first thing that we need to talk about today. We're going to talk about two parts of why stuff moves. We're going to talk about pressure from two different perspectives today. And this is where we need to really kind of understand the idea of like what pressure is. Oop, we lost someone. Uh-oh. I can't tell who we lost. Oh, we lost Thomas. All right. He'll come back. So in order for air to move out of the lungs, okay, we have to understand how pressure works. And also in order for air to move into the lungs, we have to understand how pressure works. So here's my tip for understanding the universe. You guys have probably heard me say this before if you've been in some of my other classes, but if you want to understand a little bit more about just how the whole universe, the whole universe that we live in, if you want to understand a little bit more about how it works, understand this. Nature hates gradients. Nature wants everything to be nice and even as much as it can, okay? Nature does not like a gradient. And what is a gradient? A gradient is a lot of stuff being over there and very little stuff being over there, right? So if we look at like what a gradient would look like, if I were to draw one, it would literally look like this. A triangle is a perfect example of a gradient, right? And then if this was just like filled in with stuff, right? So there's a lot of stuff over here, and then there's less stuff over here, right? Nature hates it. Nature's like, ugh, gross, move stuff this way until eventually it's nice and even. And then it would look something kind of like this, right? It would be like much more rectangular. There'd be an even amount of stuff, you know, from one part to the other, just nice and even. And that's what nature wants, right? Think of gravity, right? Gravity's trying to fill the frickin', you know, the void. Stuff rolls downhill, right? It goes to where it's sort of needed. So this is kind of what we're seeing here when we talk about like nature hating gradients. So what do you think would happen if there was a lot of oxygen over here and very little oxygen over here, right? We have lots and now we have little. Well, and let's say there's a wall in the way, right? Like just for the sake of argument, you know, even if there was like a wall right in the middle between the two, maybe like right here. Well, what do you think is going to happen? Oxygen is going to pass from this area over here where there's a lot of stuff to this area over here where there's very little stuff. This is why air actually moves into your lungs. So your lungs are these empty sacs that are attached to a muscle that rests like this. That's your diaphragm muscle. And so it normally rests in a little dome position like this. And what happens is when your diaphragm contracts, it actually flattens down like that. And that draws your lungs open. So what's going to happen is there's a certain amount of gas in the air passively all the time. And so there's a certain amount of pressure in the air all the time. And then your lungs get pulled down like this, and suddenly there's a big gap of how much air is in your lungs. And there's a whole bunch of space and not a lot of air. And nature's like, oh, gross. There's a whole bunch of stuff over here and there's very little stuff over there. And so then it moves all the air into your lungs, right? Air will naturally flow into your areas because there's going to be an area of low pressure created in your lungs, right? And so nature goes, blah, move it this way. And that moves a bunch of air into your lungs. Now, because air has a lot of oxygen in it, that oxygen has become exposed to your bloodstream. And then what happens is your diaphragm relaxes and it goes back into that dome shape. Now suddenly there's very little space in your lungs, right? Because this muscle's kind of crowding it, squeezing it. Now there's not very much space. And now guess what? There's a lot of pressure in your lungs and less pressure out in the atmosphere. And so what happens is nature again naturally moves air out of your lungs. So we are creating air pressure gradients using our diaphragm. Whenever it contracts, it pushes the air out of our lung. Whenever it relaxes back into its dome shape, it pushes air out of our lungs. Whenever it contracts, it draws our lungs open and creates an area of low pressure. So that pressure is your barometric pressure, which is just atmosphere pressure, like air pressure. Okay. This is also why your ears pop when you're on an airplane or going up going up a hill. You are experiencing like pressure changes, and so like your body's trying to like kind of maintain it, and then all of a sudden it kind of hits a threshold and actually pops. So that's barometric pressure. Okay. So nature hating gradients. For air to move out of the lungs, so air is going to leave the lungs, the pressure in the lungs has to be greater than the pressure in the, it says air here, I should change it to atmosphere. Okay, the air in the pressure in your lungs needs to be greater than the pressure in the atmosphere. And that's going to happen because your diaphragm will relax, and its relaxed position is in a dome. So that creates a lack of space in the lungs, and it naturally moves this way, right? This is why squeezing a bottle makes water come shooting out of that bottle, right? You are increasing the pressure here, and nature will naturally move something from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. And then the exact opposite is true in the other direction. So in order for air to move into the lungs, the pressure in the lungs must be less than the pressure in the, and again, that should say atmosphere. That occurs when your diaphragm contracts and flattens down, which opens up your lungs. Again, that is the process of ventilation. Now, we haven't talked about exchanging oxygen yet. We've only been talking about ventilation, which is just moving gas from one place to another. So the reason gas is moving from one place to another is because of pressure changes, okay? Does that make sense to everybody? And then lastly, gases and other materials will always move to the area of low pressure. It will always go to where there's low pressure. Okay, nature hates gradients. It will always, always, always move. Again, you want to understand how the universe works a little bit better? Understand that concept, and it will help you make sense of chemistry in general. Like we talked about, like, hey, why does water shove itself between there? Because there wasn't any water before. Lots of water, very little water. Nature moved it this way, right? And the exact opposite is true. Why did dehydration synthesis work? There was a lot of water here. There's very little water over there. So nature moved it that way. Chemistry, basic chemistry. Any questions so far? How's that doing? Questions on gradients? Seems like we're good. All right. So we talked about ventilation, talked about moving the gases, right? Now let's talk about moving oxygen in particular, okay? So now we're going to talk about respiration, which is slightly different. Respiration is where we're talking about oxygen and carbon dioxide. I have been only saying oxygen, also carbon dioxide. So now it's almost like with ventilation, we were talking about like economics. Now let's talk about exchanging $1, right? Now let's look at like oxygen versus carbon dioxide. And this is where we're looking at respirating. So during ventilation, the reason you are, creating these pressure changes to bring in like gas is because you are trying to expose oxygen to our bloodstream, right? So there is a difference between internal respiration and external respiration. External respiration's happening at the lungs. Remember, human donuts, right? We have this outside environment that happens to live inside our chest, right? But like, your mouth, if you go, there's still a big hole in there, right? There's all this space. That's part of this room. That's part of the outside environment, right? It just happens to be encased, in the same way that like, yeah, I can hold something inside my hands right now, but it's still part of the room, right? I'm not diffusing stuff through my skin just because I happen to have like a little, cup over something. So our lungs are going to experience, we call it external respiration because technically it's taking place outside the body, even though it's in our chest. And that's the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the lungs and the atmosphere. Okay, so oxygen is going to enter your bloodstream, CO2 is going to leave your bloodstream. So when we look at where those bronchioles are covered in alveoli, right? This is an example of external respiration. It is the external exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So these little blue blood vessels here, they kind of represent where your body has used up oxygen and the blood cells have carbon dioxide in them. Now, for the record, your blood is never blue. We will talk about that tomorrow. It's always red. It's just either really dark red or really bright red. But we draw it in blue to kind of represent that it's this, it's out of oxygen. It's mostly carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide, little red blood cells are traveling through this tube and they're full of carbon dioxide because they already dropped off all their oxygen. And, your muscles, you did some squats or something, right? And so now those blood cells, they're going to get to here. And now they're being exposed to, the atmosphere inside these little alveoli is just passive atmosphere, right? So then what's going to happen is they're going to drop off their CO2 molecules, right? And then oxygen molecules are going to get picked up by these blood cells here, right? And then, new oxygen is then going to travel to the glutes so that you can go do some more squats, right? So that right there, the exchange of dropping off CO2 and picking up oxygen is an example of external respiration. And it's respiration because we're talking about oxygen in particular, and it's external because it's taking place outside the body here in the lungs, right? So external respiration, oxygen enters the bloodstream, CO2 exits the bloodstream. And then you go, and you get rid of all that CO2. You vent it out. And then all of a sudden, you bring in more oxygen. You get rid of the CO2. This takes place at the lungs. That's what they want you to know here. They want you to know that external respiration is taking place at the lungs. The exact opposite of that, you say? Well, that's your internal respiration. Internal respiration is the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide at the various tissues of the body, right? So now that blood cell, is going to travel from through like the tubes of your cardiovascular system. Finding a picture that I approve of. Close. That is not in English. Sorry, just looking for just the right picture here. All this one was actually really good. It's showing you both sides. Pay attention to the right side picture, guys. Oh, you know what? It's so big, I can just hide the left side. All right, so internal respiration. Now, because we had external respiration where a blood cell picked up some oxygen after it had dropped off its CO2, now it's going to travel through the circulatory system and it's going to be exposed to the various tissues of the body. So here's this little red blood cell here, right? And it's going to travel down here and he's being exposed to these different tissues of the body, right? Let's say this is your glute muscle here, right? Well, now all the oxygen that's located on that red blood cell, it's going to pass through this little wall right here, and it's going to get into the glute muscle. And now your glute just got its oxygen delivered. Meanwhile, it had just done this already, right? Remember, this is a constant process that has just started since before you were born. And it's just constantly in a big loop, right? It's happening already. So that glute muscle, which had just been used a little bit, it has a bunch of CO2 to drop off. So that red blood cell drops off its oxygen and it picks up some new CO2. And guess what? It's going to travel back to the lungs to drop off that CO2 and pick up new oxygen. And then it's going to go right back to that tissue, drop off its oxygen, pick up CO2. So when it's happening at a tissue level inside the body, that's what we call internal respiration. The exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the tissues and the blood. Oxygen exits the bloodstream and CO2 enters the bloodstream. This takes place in your body's tissues. Okay, so that's your internal respiration. Okay, so external respirations at the lungs. What are we doing? We're getting rid of CO2. We're picking up oxygen. Internal respiration. What are we doing? We're delivering oxygen and we're picking up CO2. See how they're exact opposites of each other, guys? How are we doing on that? Opposites are sometimes a pain in the butt because you repeat it so many times that sometimes it starts to get muddled. How's everybody feel? Cody's good. Oriana, we're good.
Good.
Okay. All right. I always got to avoid, I got to make sure sometimes I over explain things and it's it was clear. And then I keep talking and people are like, okay, you lost us. You muddled it up. All right. The painting is done. Let's put it on the shelf. All right. So that's internal versus external respiration. All right, so cool. So now that we understand sort of a little bit of the physiology of things, and we kind of understand honestly the physics of it, right? Like where stuff's moving, right? All right, let's talk about let's zoom out. We're kind of done with that concept. Let's zoom out a little bit, and now let's talk about if we're talking to our clients. When we're talking to our clients, we just give them the broad strokes, right? I don't need to tell my clients about internal versus external respiration. I need to understand it in order to understand how VO2s work and how breathing works during exercise and stuff. I need to know those working parts. But now, if I'm zooming out, I'm just going to tell my client the difference between breathing in and breathing out. Let's get simple. Let's get big, right? So let's look at the process of just breathing, right? It's got two phases. You've either got your inspiration, that's breathing in, and you've got expiration, which is breathing out, right? Inspiration is all about driving air into the lungs. And like I said, air is all those gases, right? That's what I'm gonna tell my clients. I'm you're breathing in air, you're exhaling, you're getting rid of your CO2. They don't need to know all the chemistry, right? They don't need to know the physics of it, right? So inspiration begins with your diaphragm contracting. And again, the diaphragm is this big dome-shaped muscle, kind of sits like this, right? It's a dome-shaped muscle that when it relaxes, which it would be contracted like this, when it relaxes, that drives air out of your lungs because it sits in a relaxed state like this. And when it contracts, it flattens down. Relaxed, contract, relax, contract, relax. Okay, so it's a dome-shaped muscle that relaxes to drive air out of the lungs, or it contracts to flatten it down, and that drives air into the lungs. So this is how we are creating our pressure changes, right? Think about if you had a bottle, right? If you had a water bottle and you squeezed it, that would be your diaphragm contracting. And when you relax it, that would be your diaphragm relaxing. air would get shot out of the bottle, air would drive into the bottle, right? So inspiration is driving air into the lungs. Therefore, that is your diaphragm contracting. Breathing in is the active part of breathing. Expiration, driving air out of your lungs, that's the passive part of breathing. To use terms that some of you guys are familiar with when we talk about muscles and contractions, you've got concentric versus eccentric. Concentric contracting, eccentric is relaxing. Your diaphragm contracting and flattening down, that would be concentric. Your diaphragm relaxing and doming up, that would be eccentric. So inspiration is the contraction of the diaphragm and expiration is the relaxation of the diaphragm. Again, the reason we're doing this inspiration part and expiration part is because we are creating areas of high pressure and areas of low pressure, and that is driving gas into and out of the lungs, right? So inspiration is the contraction of the diaphragm flattening down, and that's going to allow the exchange of those gases to happen and increase the pressure. This will move air into the alveoli, like we talked about. Expiration is the relaxation here, okay? Now, there is obviously a little bit more that's going on here. It's not just your diaphragm working alone. You'll also notice there's all the little tiny muscles in between your ribs. Those are called your intercostal muscles. And you've got internal and external ones. They basically create kind of like an X shape. And that way, like, you can pull your ribs in both directions, right? You've got some that are pulling this way and you get the other ones that are pulling the other way. And so they kind of work crisscross like this. So internal intercostals are deeper, external intercostals are more superficial. They're towards the outside of the body, right? So external intercostals, internal intercostals. So those are contracting to also allow your rib cage to kind of lift up, and that also allows air to drive in. But here's the thing that I want you guys to remember that is very much related to like the posture side of our industry. A lot of people are chest breathers. They breathe like this. They're very good at lifting their ribs up. They're very good at like opening this whole thing. We want to primarily breathe with our diaphragm. So many people are afraid of sticking their stomach out, right? I especially like my female clients, I hear this all the time. Like they're like, no, don't pooch your stomach when you're breathing. Like breathe from your chest, right? It's, it's not proper or whatever. No sweat, Cody. We'll see you in the evening, or see you when we see you. We'll see like, they avoid breathing into their stomach because they don't want to pooch it out, right? But that is how we are meant to breathe. You should be breathing, not. Now, for the record, you can breathe like this, right? You can breathe into your chest, but that's not actually like the best way for us to drive in the most amount of gas. Those are actually using secondary respiratory muscles, helper muscles, not primary muscles. And, for those of you who, again, have been through our other classes, right? Our biggest thing, like literally, like the biggest thing, if you break down like what a trainer does, is we are constantly trying to teach people to stop using secondary muscles and start using primary muscles. People love to use the wrong muscles to do the right job. We want to learn how to contract our diaphragm. That's the best way to create inspiration and expiration, rather than using those secondary muscles. Because those secondary muscles, those intercostals, some of the muscles in your neck that are also helping, right? The ones that like lift your collarbone. The problem with using them has nothing to do with your breathing. I mean, it has a little bit to do with your breathing, but the real problem with using them is those muscles are also posture muscles. So if you're using posture muscles to also breathe, what's it going to do? Screw up your posture. And then suddenly we're going to end up like this. And you get this like forward head posture, like rounded shoulder thing, rather than like sitting upright the way we're supposed to, breathing into our stomach. So, and then suddenly you're able to not breathe because you've altered your posture. It's pretty hard to breathe when you're like this, right? So you're going to continue trying to use those secondary ones, and it's going to create a negative feedback loop, which is going to, further make the problem worse and worse and worse and worse. So that is ventilation, right? So looking at this pressure, right? So at the end of like normal respiration, the pressure in your lungs, again, like I said, it is less than the pressure in the atmosphere, and that's what drives air in. That's inspiration, right? So the volume of this cavity, because your diaphragm contracts down, the volume increases. There's an area of low pressure. Air comes in. Air is now exposed, right? And then during expiration, the muscles relax, and now suddenly there's very little space in here. There's very little volume, so the pressure is really high, and air leaves. Again, it gets very repetitive when we're describing this stuff. So we got to talk about those different volumes, right? We got to understand like what volume is what during breathing. So we have a couple different lung volumes here that are associated with like different phases of breathing. So we just call them overall like your lung volumes, right? And they're all different depending on like your gender, your physical conditioning, you know, your age, body size, you know, like all of those things are going to change your actual lung volumes, like how much space. Obviously, if you're like a large person, it's going to have a larger, you know, lung, which makes sense because it's going to support their larger body. But, you know, we have some general terms for these. So lung volumes are the volume of air that are associated with the different phases of breathing. Now, right now, everybody in this call, myself included, we are all using a lung volume called your tidal volume. Okay, tidal volume is the volume of air during normal, quiet breathing. So if we look at like lung volumes here, we kind of look at it in like a little chart form. It's gonna look something kind of like, ooh, no, let's get a colored one. Let's get a colored one without math. That'll work. All right, so here's our lung volumes. Right now, everybody's using, we call it tidal volume. Tidal with a D, kind of like the tide, right? It's a breathe in, it's a breathe out. It's breathing in, it's breathing out. And it's like you're listening to NPR radio. And it's a nice podcast where you're very relaxed. You know, like that's tidal volume, right? You're all doing that right now, just normal breath, okay? And so you're not using your entire lung capacity, and you're not exhaling all of your lung capacity either. There's like a little bit, right? Like right now, just go ahead and breathe normally for a few seconds. And then catch yourself at the top of a breath. And then stop. You still got a lot of space, right, left? Right, tons of space left. Well, that space that's left beyond like a normal breath in, right? Instead of stopping here, if you kept breathing in, that is what is referred to, and I hope my notes go in the right order. That, because I'm noticing that tidal volume was at the very end here. Why the PowerPoint did that, I don't know. So tidal volume is normal breathing in during quiet breathing or normal breathing, right? Because it kind of sounds like the tide. Then there's all that space that's left, right? You get the top of a normal breath, but then you could just go big deep breath in, right? Maybe you're watching a movie and then all of a sudden you go, right? That volume that's left, that's your inspiratory reserve volume. And your inspiratory reserve is the maximal amount of air that can be drawn into your lungs after a normal respiration. So a normal respiration would be tidal volume. All the space that is left, that is your inspiratory reserve. Now, that is something that can be diminished. For instance, like if you were a smoker and there is now a bunch of tar in your lungs, that could limit how flexible your lungs are. You know, your lungs are pasted with all this sticky substance, which is going to kind of make it less flexible and it won't be able to expand as much. So that's one of the things that can actually decrease your lung volume, right? Or maybe you were in an accident. Maybe you have really tight muscles that don't allow your rib cage. There's a lot of things that can decrease your inspiratory reserve volume. Like as we get older, this number decreases, for instance, right? We become a little less flexible, you know, and so we can't expand our lungs as much. So that's the inspiratory reserve volume. It's everything that's left beyond a normal breath. Well, guess what? You've also got an expiratory reserve, which now go back to normal quiet breathing. and then catch yourself at the bottom of an exhale and go like this. You still got a little bit, right? You still got a little bit you could exhale just at the very end beyond a normal exhale. That's your expiratory reserve. Now you'll notice inspiratory reserve is much larger than the expiratory reserve, which you can probably feel, right? Catch yourself during a normal breath at the top and then do more, right? And then catch yourself at the normal and then do more. Doesn't feel like as much, right? So your expiratory reserve volume is much less. So inspiratory reserve, the maximal amount of air that can be drawn in after a normal breath. So it's the amount of space left after your tidal volume. Expiratory reserve, the volume of air that can be expelled after normal expiration. It's the amount of space left after an exhale during the tidal volume, okay? And then there is this term where it's like, okay, well, what if we describe all the way from the biggest breath we can take in to the biggest exhale we can make? That is what's called your vital capacity. So your vital capacity is the greatest amount of air that can be inhaled or exhaled. So if we go to your inspiratory reserve and we go to your expiratory reserve, that's your vital capacity. All right, you've just done the hardest max effort sprint you've ever done. You just run from a bear, right? And you're there and you're like, like you're using your vital capacity. I always like to use the bear example because it's like, yeah, vital capacity, right? Like it's what kept you alive from that bear. The greatest amount of air. Now, for the record, there is just a little bit of volume left in your lungs. I always like to think of this. Imagine if like you took a sack, like a paper sack, and you crumpled it all up. You know, for the most part, yeah, you got all the air out of that sack, but like you could really squeeze it just a little bit more. You could always compress it just a little bit more. The amount of space that was left before you really compressed it, we do have what's called your residual volume. And it's like all of the volume that's left just beyond like a normal, like you tried your best to get all the air out of your lungs, but there's just a little bit of space left. That's the residual volume. We don't want to tap into that. We want to leave the residual volume alone. Because like if you really did get into that, you might be collapsing your lung. So maybe don't try to tap into that residual volume. Just go to your regular expiratory reserve. So vital capacity is inspiratory reserve to expiratory reserve. Tidal volume is normal, quiet breathing. And then the last little thing that's not necessarily a volume, I mean, I guess it kind of is, but is what is called your minute ventilation. Your minute ventilation is the volume of air that is being inspired or expired per minute. So like if we were just measuring how much gas is being exchanged per minute, that's your minute ventilation. It's your tidal volume times your frequency of breath. So let's say your tidal volume, if we look at this picture here, tidal volume is 500 milliliters, right, of gas, 500 milliliters of air. And you were breathing, let's say 10 times per minute, because that's going to make the math easy. Hopefully you're breathing more than that. That would mean that you are, 500 times 10, you would be, your tidal volume, you'd be breathing in 5,000 units of gas, which would actually make it pretty easy for us to calculate if we were, in a lab, how much oxygen that is, right? Remember, air components, how much of gas is actually oxygen? Well, only about 20.95%. So 5,000 times 0.2059. So guess what? You brought in 1,029.5 units of oxygen. That's kind of cool. We can actually math it out. Do we need to? No. You guys know how to do it now. Here's the thing. You're never going to really do this unless you're working in a lab that's actually doing VO2 testing. VO2 testing is the volume of oxygen test. But that is something you can tell your clients to go do. And you might find yourself working in a place like this, by the way. you know, like if you wanted to go get a VO2 test near me. Oh, that's not how you type near. Nearest. So VO2 max, right? Your VO2 is your volume of oxygen consumed. It's not the volume of air brought into your lungs, it's the volume of oxygen consumed. And so what you do is you wear a little mask like this, and it's connected to a little computer. It's connected to a little machine here called the cardio coach. And this machine is measuring, this mask is, it's got an intake valve. This is where air is coming in. And then whenever you exhale, air is not coming out here. It's trapped and it goes into this tube and then it goes into the machine. And the machine is measuring how much air is coming in and how much gas is coming in and how much gas is coming out. And then it's measuring what's in that gas. So the machine knows how much oxygen's in the atmosphere. We just looked it up, right? It's 20%. And so if you brought in 5,000 units of air, right, which 20% of it was oxygen, you brought in, what was that number we came up with? 1,029 units of oxygen. Well, here's the thing. When you exhale, when you are breathing, right, you are turning oxygen into carbon dioxide. So we said it was 1,029 units of oxygen, right, out of the 5,000 bits of air. Let's say you exhale 800 CO2 molecules, right, instead of like the 1,000 here. So 800 CO2 divided by 1,029 oxygen, that means that 77% of the oxygen that you brought into your body got used up, and 23% of it didn't, which means you are probably on that treadmill doing a pretty gentle like workout. You're probably doing like a light jog, about 77%. We're going to understand this a little bit deeper in just a second, but that's what those machines do. So I know that this seems really technical, and I know that like I'm talking about these lung volumes and you're like, why are we talking about this? Because you ever want to understand how those machines work and you find yourself working in a place like this, which by the way, I totally recommend. If you can get into a job working at one of these testing facilities, Lorianne, we were talking about this, right? You were like, I don't see myself working on the floor at like 24-hour fitness. You're like, that's not where you see yourself in 5 years, right? Well, maybe you find yourself in one of these labs, right? VO2 test at a place like DexaFit. The way these machines work, these metabolic machines, they are measuring the oxygen coming in versus the CO2 going out. And it tells your client, let me see if I can get a picture of the results. Yeah, you are going to get a little printout when you put your client through that test, and their printout's going to look like this. By the way, they're also wearing a heart rate monitor because honestly, they're not going to be able to measure their oxygen, you know, in their workouts. What they're going to be able to pay attention to is their heart rate, right? They're going to have a little heart rate watch. So when they're doing this test, you can't see it in a lot of these pictures, but they are also wearing a heart rate monitor under the clothes. Can I just get a picture with someone having the heart rate monitor on, please? Thank you. So, so I can prove, right? These little electrodes here, that's attached to their heart. This one's like, that's like a full ECG, but normally it'll just be a normal everyday heart rate monitor. So what this does is the machine translates their heart rate to how many calories they are burning per hour, because it's measuring how much oxygen is coming in versus how much CO2 is going out. So when their heart rate's 140, this person's burning 795 calories per hour. When their heart rate's 170, they're burning 1,119 calories per hour. That's how the VO2 machine works. So the higher the VO2, the more oxygen they're able to consume. The more oxygen they're able to consume, the more calories they're burning. So we are able to translate that information. And now, let's say this client right here goes to a birthday party and has a 500 calorie, slice of cake. And they're like, crap, I'm trying to lose weight right now, and I have this extra 500 calories. Well, okay, go get your heart rate at 110 for an hour, and you will burn off that extra cupcake. Or go get your heart rate at 160 for a half an hour, and you will burn off that cupcake, or whatever I said, slice of cake, right? So that's why we need to translate this information. This is, I know that like all this stuff seems very technical today, but trust me, it can relate to parts of our industry directly. You guys are going to have a deeper understanding of how breathing and inspiration and stuff works. So that's our minute ventilation. That's why we can calculate those numbers. Exciting career paths. All right. Oh, I forgot to mention the best part. These VO2 tests, by the way, they take about 20 minutes. So you do about 20 minutes of work, and I don't know how they'll do it where like different places pay, but like when I used to do VO2 testing, it was an extra service that was offered where I worked as a trainer. And if someone booked a VO2 session with me, where I would also then give them a little science explanation, it would take me about 20 minutes to run through the test. I would take about 10 minutes to break down in a language they could understand how to use and interpret the results. And I'd send them home with their information. They would pay about $100 and I would keep about 65 of that. So I made like $65 in about 30 minutes of work, 20 minutes of me standing on my feet, hitting a button on a machine, and then 10 minutes of explaining it to my client. It's a pretty good deal. It's not a bad job. So something to think about. All right, moving on. So let's talk about the gas exchange in the body, right? So we talked about like gas exchange at the lungs, right? So here's the anatomical pieces we've already kind of been talking about a little bit about, but again, just so we fully understand this, right? So gas exchange takes place in two parts of the body. It happens at the lungs and it happens at the tissue level, right? So you have different capillaries, which are all those little blood vessels. Those are little blood vessels that are covering stuff in the body, right? They form those little beds, right? They're either going to cover your alveoli, that's at the lungs, or they're going to cover your tissues, and that's throughout the body. So those are your different those are the blood vessels where this exchange is kind of happening, right? So the first exchange site will start at the lungs, okay? You've got your pulmonary capillaries, your lung capillaries. Those are the ones that are microscopic blood vessels that are forming little beds, and they are covering not so much like the tissues, right? Like we're seeing here, covering, I guess this is skin tissue, I'd assume. This is covering the alveoli, right? So they're forming little beds covering those little pieces of popcorn, okay? And what's going to happen at those pulmonary capillaries is oxygen from the lungs will diffuse into the blood cells, and CO2 will diffuse from the blood cells into the lungs, okay? So we're going to exchange those gases. And then the exact opposite is happening at your body's tissues, okay? So your body's tissues, gas is moving between the cells and the capillaries, right? So gas exchange occurs between the body's cells and the capillaries that are covering those cells. Oxygen from the blood diffuses into the tissue, CO2 from the tissue diffuses into the blood. So it's exactly in reverse, right? At the body's tissues, we are picking up, where the tissues are picking up oxygen, they're dropping off CO2. At the lungs, we are dropping off CO2 and picking up oxygen. So they are doing exactly the opposite, right? It's an Amazon delivery driver picking up the package from the warehouse into their van, driving that van to your house, dropping off the package, and picking up a signature. I didn't realize my analogy broke down at the end. Signing for it, I don't know. I forget that last one. So that's the exchange that's happening there, right? Now, how is all this happening? Why is oxygen moving the way it is, right? That's the one thing we haven't really gotten too far into yet. Well, there's a chemistry thing happening here, right? Remember, pressure changes. We talked about like air pressure. Well, there are also chemical pressures. And this is another form of gradients, right? You have in your blood cells a little protein called hemoglobin. One more reason for us to consume lots and lots of protein in our diet. And it's a protein that contains a molecule of iron. One more reason to get lots and lots of iron in your diet. And iron is very much attracted to oxygen. Oxygen and iron They really get along quite well together. And so oxygen is going to be attracted to iron, okay? And hemoglobin is a protein that has iron in the center of it, okay? It's a little protein that actually kind of looks like this. There's actually, you can see, this is a like first bit of hemoglobin. There's actually there's four little iron molecules here in the center. So one there, one there, one there. And there's four little main components to hemoglobin. So if hemoglobin is this whole thing, it's got a molecule of iron at the bottom of each of these. And each of these are attracted to bits of oxygen. So in a red blood cell, you've got hemoglobin. Hemoglobin has iron at its heart, and that's what actually grabs onto oxygen or grabs onto some of the CO2. So, and there's a slight difference here, right? So in men, for every 100 milliliters of blood, you've got about 15 milligrams of hemoglobin. And for women, that's slightly less. For every 100 milliliters of blood, you get about 13 grams of hemoglobin. So this is one of the reasons why men are going to have a slightly higher VO2 max than women are, because we are able to consume more oxygen because we're able to carry a little bit more oxygen. That's also part of like the changes that occur, like why men tend to have like larger muscles and things like that, because we are able to, deliver this fuel source a little bit easier than women are. And that, again, difference between like type 2 and type 1 muscle fibers. Women have to be a little bit better in endurance because they don't have quite as much oxygen delivery, so they have to be able to keep going. And that's actually why you'll see the difference between like men and women's, maybe like weightlifting, the poundages, it's a fairly large difference. But if you look at the difference between like men's marathons and women's marathons, the difference is much smaller. The more endurance you get, the difference between the sexes sort of shrinks. But the more anaerobic you get, the more like heavy lifting you get, the difference sort of increases. So there is a slight difference between the sexes there. Hemoglobin. Oh, and by the way, this is also why your blood is red. What happens when iron grabs oxygen? The iron rusts, right? It becomes this kind of reddish color. That is what is making your blood always red. If you've ever wondered why Mars is red, it's got a lot of iron in the soil. So iron turns bright red when it's combined with oxygen. Again, this is why that's why your blood is always red. For the record, there is stuff such as blue blood out there. There are animals that do have blue blood. Starfish, they actually have blue blood. Well, I think some starfish. I don't know if all of them do. But they use what is called oxycyanin. Nope, that's definitely not what I'm looking up. Hemoglobin versus, no, God dang it. What is that called? Oh, there it is. Hemocyanin. God, it started with hemo. So yeah, like certain squids, some spiders that are out there, certain animals do actually have blue blood. It's because they actually don't use iron in their blood. They use copper. And what happens when copper gets oxygenated, it turns a bluish color. That is why, okay, let's try oxygenated copper. That's why if you've ever looked at a penny, sometimes it's like a slight bluish color. That's why the Statue of Liberty is kind of bluish, because Statue of Liberty is made of copper. And it is definitely being exposed to oxygen for a very long time. So yeah, starfish, they use copper instead of iron at their blood. There's some green blood out there, like in certain worms and stuff. They use chlorochromone. I don't know how to pronounce that, but and then there's even like purple blood out there, which is sort of a combo of these two together. So that's kind of fun, right? So our blood is never blue. It's just always red. It's just either dark red or it's bright red. It sometimes looks blue when you combine it with like the pigment of, you know, skin. Basically your eyes are absorbing all the red that you can by looking at your skin, and then you can't see anymore, and so it looks bluish. So hemoglobin is this protein that attracts the oxygen molecules, and that is why oxygen's moving in the direction that it is. Now, there is like a certain amount of saturation, a maximal amount of saturation that you can have depending on how much hemoglobin is in your red blood cells. The more cardio you do, guys, the more cardiovascular exercise you do, the more hemoglobin your body will make in your red blood cells. What does that mean? It means that you can absorb and bring in more oxygen, therefore increasing your volume of oxygen consumed, or your VO2 max, which we talked about, right? The maximal amount of oxygen you can consume. The more oxygen you can consume, the better shape you are in. And the more, and I know that because you have more hemoglobin, your cells, Bae, this is for you, have more mitochondria. They're able to use more of that oxygen, right? And you probably have like more muscle fibers and things like that, right? So see how it's all starting to come together, guys, right? We're talking about like the more you can consume, that means the better shape you're in. So that's one of the reasons why our goal when doing cardio training is to improve our clients' VO2 max. Paula, we haven't taught you this yet, but you're going to learn this assessment that we teach called the YMCA step test and or the Rockport walk test, which are these two cardio assessments that we put our clients through, and they are measuring how well your client consumes oxygen. The more they can consume, the better shape they are in. And it means they have more things like hemoglobin and other stuff. Now, there is a special version of hemoglobin that we got to be aware of in our job, especially, called myoglobin. And anytime you see the prefix myo, we are talking about muscles. So myoglobin is a protein just like hemoglobin, but instead of like hemoglobin carries oxygen and CO2 in your blood cells, myoglobin is a protein that carries oxygen to your muscle cells. So hemoglobin will drop off its oxygen and myoglobin will grab it. And because your muscles are so oxygen hungry, they have this special protein that will deliver it. So myoglobin is a protein found in your muscle fibers that binds to oxygen and when there's like a really high volume of oxygen, right? So it will grab it from the red blood cells, and then it will carry it to wherever the muscle needs that oxygen the most, and that's where it'll drop it off. So it's found in your heart muscle, your cardiac muscle. It's definitely found in your skeletal muscle, and it's especially found in your slow twitch, which is your endurance type muscle. That's where we have the most myoglobin. And this is where we've, one thing we're going to talk about later, we're just going to kind of allude to it right now. There's a difference between our muscle fiber types. You've got type 1 muscle and you've got type 2 muscle. Your type 2 muscle is your fast twitch muscle. That's your big bulky muscles. They actually don't consume very much oxygen. Your type 1 muscle is your slow twitch muscle. And that is your endurance muscle, right? And if you look at the difference, let's see if I can find a picture that I'm looking for here. Actually, this is pretty good. Yeah, this will work. Well, hold on. I want to see some mitochondria. Okay. This actually, that's the difference in cardiac and stuff. Okay, so your type 1 muscle will have more mitochondria in it. Remember, mitochondria consumes oxygen and spits out ATP. Type 2 muscle actually doesn't consume as much oxygen. It's going to consume some, make no mistake about it, but it will actually consume less oxygen. It produces energy in the fluid of the cell. So if you're looking at the difference cellular wise, if you look at like, if you pulled out a little bit of like my calf muscles, which are very much endurance muscles, versus if you pulled out a little bit of like my pec muscle, which is very much like a type 2, right? So this would be a little bit more type 2, my calves would be a little bit more type 1, and you looked at those cells under a microscope, my type 1 muscles, which are my endurance muscles, they need to eat a lot of oxygen. They're producing energy in the mitochondria. So you're going to see more mitochondria, you're going to see more myoglobin, right? So more, and you also, if you were to look at the tissue, you'd see it covered in more blood vessels. There'd be more blood vessels in those too, because it's all about like, hey, I need all the tools that deliver oxygen. I need all the tools that eat oxygen and spit out energy, right? So more mitochondria, more myoglobin. My blood will probably have a lot of hemoglobin in it as well. And then you'll see more capillaries covering the tissue. Then if you go to my more type 2 muscle fibers, you know, they're going to be a little bit larger in size, which means they're going to have more cellular plasma. They're going to be better at glycolysis, producing energy outside the mitochondria. They're going to have some mitochondria, but they're not going to have as many. They're going to have they're going to be larger cells, not as much mitochondria, and there's not going to be as much myoglobin in my muscle there, right? Because they don't need to deliver as much oxygen. They're producing energy in the absence of oxygen. So that, again, if we've talked about the difference between type 1 and type 2 muscles, it comes down to this structure stuff, right? It comes down to this physical differences. So slow twitch muscle fibers are going to have a higher level of myoglobin, which makes them better at utilizing oxygen. Okay. Now, we have been talking a lot about oxygen today because oxygen is kind of the star of the show. You know, it's what's keeping our cells alive. But let's talk a little bit about the waste products here. We do got to get rid of our waste products. Whenever we're talking about this stuff, you know, we got to understand a little bit about CO2. So CO2, carbon dioxide, is transported 3 ways in the blood. Some of it is dissolved in a physical solution of your blood. So some of your carbon dioxide is actually dissolved in your blood, and it becomes like that actual like CO2. We combine a little bit of carbon with a little bit of oxygen, right? And then like that's just going to be transported the same way by your red blood cells, just like oxygen. It's just going in the opposite direction, right? Some of it is going to be bicarbonate. About 60% of it actually is going to be diffused from the tissues to the red blood cells, and then it's going to be sort of combined with like a little bit of like sodium bicarbonate actually, and that's happening in your blood's plasma. This is another reason why sodium is actually one of our essential nutrients. For the record, Americans, we have a little bit too much sodium in our diet, so take it easy on the salt. But it is actually very important to have plenty of sodium. We talk, you know, sometimes people talk about like needing potassium and that's what's causing them to like cramp up. They're like, oh, I need a banana because I'm cramping up. That could be true. And oftentimes it is, because it's like most people are not getting enough potassium. They're getting plenty of sodium. But it could actually also be a lack of sodium could cause your cramping. You are leaving carbon dioxide in your tissues and you're not able to like get that crap out of there, and you're not getting enough oxygen. Then your muscles can't function properly because they're not getting oxygen delivery, right? And then there is this carbamino compounds. And so when carbon dioxide binds to hemoglobin, you get what is called carbaminoglobin, carbaminohemoglobin, yeah. And that is actually a specialized protein. And what that does is that protein changes the shape of hemoglobin, which lowers its affinity for oxygen. That's actually really important because hemoglobin's normally, you know, really good at combining to oxygen, but we don't want it to be good at combining to oxygen when we want it grabbing CO2. So this is what's kind of interesting about what happens to hemoglobin. Remember, hemoglobin it's these 4 little proteins, right? And it will actually change shape. Let me see if I can get a picture of this. Hold on. Hemoglobin, shape change, oxygen affinity. Let's see if that works. No. Okay. That's all right. I'll just kind of visualize it for you guys. Hemoglobin. Okay. So here's our molecule of hemoglobin within our red blood cell, right? It's these four little shapes here. So right now, let's say this is its base version. It doesn't have any oxygen on it. This shape is actually, what's kind of funny about these is another rule of the universe that you guys can remember. When something binds to proteins, it encourages those proteins to change shape. This is why our muscles are actually able to contract, because they're made of a bunch of proteins. And then when something unbinds to proteins, that also encourages them to change shape. So what's funny about hemoglobin is the first oxygen molecule actually kind of has a hard time grabbing this iron because it's just not in a shape that's very conducive to it. So what'll happen is eventually there'll be such a large concentration of oxygen compared to like how much oxygen's in the red blood cell that it will sort of be like, oh, finally, there's such a large concentration that first oxygen molecule will actually bind. And what'll happen is that protein will actually twist its shape a little bit and it'll grab right here. And now oxygen's officially bound to this little molecule or this little heme right here, right? That will actually, because this changed shape, that will actually increase hemoglobin's affinity for more oxygen. And now this one over here will have an easier time grabbing the second oxygen molecule. That will change its shape, which will make this one's job even easier. And then that oxygen molecule will bind. And then this fourth one's got a really easy time. Then once it gets to the body's tissue, guess what? It kind of has a hard time letting go. But then eventually there will be such a high concentration, it'll be like, okay, great. And then it'll drop off its first oxygen. That will change its shape back to where it was. And that will make the second one's job a little bit easier to drop off. That'll make the third one's job a little bit easier. Then the fourth one's got a, cakewalk. That is why we have this thing called carbaminohemoglobin. The same thing is true for CO2. Hemoglobin really likes oxygen, and it's like frenemies with CO2. Like it's like, yeah, we get along, right? And so like the first little bit of CO2 actually has a really hard time binding to hemoglobin. But once it finally does, and it's like, all right, this isn't so bad. It changes shape. That makes the second one a little bit easier to bind. That makes the third one a little bit easier to bind. That makes the fourth one a little bit easier to bind. And then the process just kind of repeats, okay, over and over and over and over again. So some carbon dioxide is really important to have in your blood because you actually don't want your carbon dioxide levels to completely bottom out. So class survey here. Has anybody in here ever had a panic attack? Has anybody in here ever had, yeah, Lorianne?
Yeah.
Bay, Thomas, Paula, have you ever hyperventilated where you're just like, it just feels like you can't breathe?
No.
Yes.
Yeah. So here's what that is, and here's what to do the next time it happens. So the reason that is happening, and this is the thing, right? It feels like you can't breathe, right? It feels like you're like, I'm not getting enough air. I'm not getting enough air. I need to breathe, right? And you start breathing more. Here's the problem. When you are breathing like that, you are actually using, go back to earlier on our lesson, you start to use those secondary respiratory muscles more. That makes you very good at exhaling CO2, but then you take these little tiny shallow breaths in and you don't bring in very much oxygen. Actually, I'm sorry, you bring in lots of oxygen, but you're really good at getting rid of CO2. Little tiny shallow breaths like that, exhale CO2 like crazy. Now, that may sound like a good thing, right? That may sound like a really good thing because I've spent all day today talking about we want oxygen, we got to get rid of CO2. But here's the thing, without enough CO2, you will not have this protein right here, the carbaminohemoglobin. And without it, oxygen ends up just kind of sitting in your blood cells, and it just kind of stays there. So when you're actually having a panic attack, this sounds kind of weird, but the problem is that you do not have enough CO2 in your blood. You don't have enough of that waste product in your blood. You have too much oxygen and not enough CO2. So how do you fix this problem? Because now what's happening is you are literally not exchanging oxygen. Remember, we need a gradient, right? We need lots of stuff over here and very little stuff over here. What we have done is nature's got its way, and now it's even on both sides. We're having we've got this going on over here, right? We ended up like no gradient, so oxygen's not moving anywhere. That's not good. So what do we need to do to fix a panic attack? We need to raise our CO2 levels. So how do you do that? I don't have a sack on me, but you would breathe into a paper bag. You would grab a little paper bag and you would exhale. When you exhale, you're losing a little bit of CO2, but then that CO2 gets trapped in the bag. Then you inhale and all that CO2 comes back into your body and it might raise your levels. Then you exhale again and now more CO2, but again, it's all getting trapped in the bag. And then you inhale and you're reintroducing all of your CO2 back into your blood until eventually we end up with a gradient. And now oxygen will start diffusing again and it'll start working the way it's supposed to. So that if you ever have one of those panic attacks, what you want to try to do is try to breathe into a paper sack, and then that will reintroduce that CO2 back into, and eventually you'll end up with enough, it's so hard to say, carbaminohemoglobin. You'll end up with enough of that you will be able to start, diffusing oxygen the way we're supposed to again. And that is your panic attack lesson for the day. Which, after all this freaking chemistry, I would understand if you had. No. All right, last little thing we're going to talk about is some stuff that honestly we aren't really going to deal with all that often, but it's here in the PowerPoint, so we're just going to finish up with this. There's a few things to be aware of. There's the diffusing capacity. This is the rate at which all of this can exchange. If you take a really fast deep breath in and you take a really fast deep breath out, you might not have enough time to actually move that gas. Good God. So you do need to give this time. That's another thing where, and it seems impossible when you're having a panic attack to actually do this. But one other thing that could also help you would be to, and again, I know this is going to sound completely impossible, but holding your breath will actually increase your CO2 levels because you're not exchanging oxygen. Good luck having the soundness of mind to actually do that mid panic attack. That will feel, that will probably honestly make it psychologically worse. But diffusing capacity could also change this, right? If you don't have enough time, this is why in yoga, you take a big deep breath in, and you hold it for a second, and then you do a slow exhale. You are increasing your diffusing capacity. You're giving it more time. And then there's also transit time. And transit time is, how long is it going to take for my blood cell to get from here to my right big toe? It's not close, right? So that's another thing to be aware of, how long that takes. And that is also going to be determined and coordinated by how well your circulatory system's working. Is your heart pumping effectively? Are the blood cells blocked? Is there stuff in the way? Are they flexible or are they stiff? All of that's going to change that as well. And so these are all things that kind of lead to different levels of cardiovascular fitness and different levels of cardiovascular health, right? Some of it is oxygen related, which is why we started today by talking about the respiratory system. And pivoting into tomorrow's conversation, some of it is cardiovascular related. Some of it is how well your cardiovascular system is able to transport this stuff. So oxygen delivery is the product of what we call cardiac output and the arterial content of oxygen. So how much oxygen is in your actual blood and how well your heart is pumping that blood around. Okay. And tomorrow we will look at cardiac output. I'm not going to put this definition in your notes today because we're going to see it tomorrow. But cardiac output is the overall function of your heart. It's how often your heart is beating. So the number of beats in a minute. that's your heart rate, and how much blood is getting sent per pump. So if it's a strong squeeze, lots of blood's moving. If it's a really weak, flimsy squeeze, blood's not moving very much.
What was that fat?
What's that, Tom?
Oh, sorry.
Oh, you're good. And then there's the overall oxygen utilization. Obviously, your muscles have the ability to like extract oxygen in order to like sustain both, aerobic and anaerobic like power, right? And so like this is going to depend on, how much oxygen's available. So like how much you are making oxygen available into your lungs. It's also going to depend on the distribution of blood flow. So how well your cardiovascular system can pump things around, and how much oxygen is actually be carried by your blood cells. Your blood cells, if they've got lots of hemoglobin in them, they can carry lots of oxygen. If they have very little hemoglobin in them, they will not. So summarizing everything up today, the big things I want you to remember. I want you to know a lot about the anatomy, get these structures down. Ventilation is driving gas into the lungs and gas out of the lungs. Respiration is exchanging oxygen for carbon dioxide. There's internal respiration, which is happening at a tissue level, right? Internal respiration is like my tissues are picking up the oxygen that my blood cells are dropping off, and my tissues are dropping off CO2 so that my blood cell can get it back to my lungs. Then there's external respiration, which is happening in my lungs, where that CO2 from my muscle is being dropped off into the lungs, and then oxygen's being picked up by the blood cell to get back to whatever tissue it happens to be going to. So ventilation is gas moving into and out of the lungs. Respiration is oxygen being exchanged for CO2, either at the lungs or at the tissues. In your lungs, you've got your bronchi. Those are the primary like tubes. And then those bronchi branch until they get really, 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 really small. Once they're really small, we call them a bronchiole. And then at the end of every bronchiole is a little popcorn shaped sac called your alveoli. And that's where oxygen's being exposed to all of those little capillaries, the blood vessels that have like, cells with it, blood cells in them. And that's where that exposure is happening. Those are our respirations. Two processes of breathing: inspiration, which is breathing in, that's inward ventilation, and then expiration is the process of breathing out. That is happening because of your diaphragm. When your diaphragm relaxes, it's in a dome shape, so that would be expiration. That's the passive part of breathing. And when your diaphragm contracts, that draws your lungs open. That is inspiration. Lung volumes, honestly, the only one they'll ever ask you about is tidal volume. Lung volumes are the different capacities. Tidal volume is normal, quiet breathing. Obviously, you could take a bigger, deeper breath. That would be your inspiratory reserve. You could also make a bigger, deeper exhale. That's your expiratory reserve. And then your vital capacity is the biggest inhale you can take to the biggest exhale you can take. And then getting into hemoglobin. So hemoglobin is the protein in your blood cells that actually carries oxygen and carries CO2. And then there's myoglobin, which is the special version of hemoglobin that exists within your muscles. So if like hemoglobin dropped off some oxygen to the muscle and then it's got to get to a specific part of the muscle, the myoglobin will carry it the rest of the way. So think of like hemoglobin as traveling down like a freeway and myoglobin is traveling, through someone's driveway. Yeah, that we will get into like, we mentioned muscles today, but honestly, we'll talk about muscles later on and make that make way more sense. You won't be tested on those until later. So I know that a lot of moving pieces today, a little bit of chemistry today. Sounds very, very technical, but hopefully we got a good concept. It'll definitely tie together really well. It really cements tomorrow when we talk about like the cardiovascular system, because we're going to reference like delivering all this stuff. We're going to talk about blood tomorrow, and we're going to look at the cardiovascular systems, the heart, we're going to look at the blood, and we're going to look at the blood vessels where everything's traveling. And it really kind of all comes together in like a big click moment. But does anybody have any questions about today's lesson? Any comments or any concerns? Anybody, worried about anything? Bay's feeling good. Lorianne, Paula, Thomas?
Good, just gonna review.
Yeah, good review.
Cool. For the record, this would be found in, I want to say chapter 3 of your regular NASM, but they really skimp on the details. We have definitely gone way more in depth than your textbook will. Again, because we're not just prepping you to pass the NASM exam, we're prepping you. Some of you guys might want to work in a VO2 testing facility. It's an easy gig. You just make people sprint as hard as they can and, try to keep them calm as they try to sprint while wearing a mask. Speaking of panic attacks, sometimes you'll get people who get a little claustrophobic.
Where do they do that?
They usually do, a lot of college universities will do it. But like that's, usually they'll have like staff for that. There's just different clinics and stuff. Here, let me put it back on screen share. They're kind of their own separate businesses that are out there. VO2 test near me. Like I said, like DexaFit. Now, DexaFit does VO2 testing, but that's actually like this is in Orange County. But like they actually are going to do like DEXA scans are probably their primary, and then RMR tests are another one. RMR tests are what you're seeing here, where she's laying down. That's actually testing just your base metabolism, not while you're sprinting. So the same machine does it, but there's a VO2 test, and then the other one was the RMR test. And then this company also is doing like, it looks like they're doing DNA testing, and they'll tell you like what your, ancestry is and like what type of foods you might want to avoid. So like this company is like a company that does all these different interesting like little scans. I'm assuming with the name like DexaFit, yeah, they have a DEXA scan as well, which is basically like a really low grade X-ray test that can tell you your bone density. It can tell you your body fat composition and things like that. So this is like a company that basically created an assessment lab, right? And there's other ones out there, I said nearest to me. Let's try 91. Let me punch in my zip code. Yeah, Body Spec in Culver City. Good Lord, why are these all so far away? There's one in Beverly Hills. So they're companies that do different types of tests and then they explain it. Here's like a travel one. I didn't know they had a travel one. I'm sure they can't travel with a DEXA, but in the last couple of years, they came out with a Bluetooth. They came out with like a non-tube attached version. Like the technology has just gotten better. There's a thing, called the VO2 Master. Check it out. Now it's just attached, and it just the machine is in the mask now, and then it just goes to a Bluetooth like phone. And then you can print from your phone. So that's kind of cool. I honestly saw this and was like, that's crazy. If you could put a treadmill in a van, or you could put like a spin bike in a van, you could travel to people's houses and test their VO2 maxes there. Pretty freaking cool. It's only the VO2 and the RMR testing that it does. It wouldn't be able to do like body fat testing and stuff. But I was like, this could be a whole business and you could just travel to people's houses. This friggin' thing's like the VO2 Master is like, it's like $5,000. Nope, $6,500. But I mean, if you were charging like $110 a test, like, pays for itself pretty freaking quick, but this could be a whole business where you just travel to people's houses and like, you write them a cardio program. You don't even have to train them. And then you test, be like, I'll see you in 30 days and we'll test it again and look for improvements. So, there's just companies out there that do it.
Out of curiosity, what kind of clients are
Usually athletes. I mean, honestly, that's not true actually. Athletes are definitely concerned about like their VO2 max improving. They pay a lot of attention. Like I'm trying to keep track of my VO2 whenever I can. I don't do RMR testing. I use the slightly less accurate sort of map versions of VO2 testing, like the Rockport walk test and some other ones. But you want to see like improvements. You just can track your heart rate and then put your body weight and use a big complicated formula. But obviously that's not going to be as accurate as like actually measuring oxygen. So athletes are concerned, but honestly, like weight loss clients, because if I know how much you weigh and I know how much oxygen you're consuming, again, with math, I can tell you exactly how many calories you burn per hour when your heart rate is X. So like, again, if you're like, I need to burn 700 calories a day from exercise, you could wear a heart rate monitor and be like, all right, my heart rate can either be 130 for 48 minutes, or my heart rate can be 150 for 29 minutes, and then you could calculate it out. So weight loss clients it's really helpful. I used really specific numbers there. No one ever gets that specific, but that should, highlight, you get what I mean. So yeah, those are typically the people who are most interested, or seniors who are trying to see, maintain their health.
Like heart attack people.
Yeah, they're a little bit
Myocardial.
more concerned. I mean, honestly, heart attack people should just be paying attention to their pulse, but like, still, it is all tied together. It's all one big system.
Okay.
So absolutely. All right, guys. Kill the recording.